Thank you for coming to the vSphere availability session. My name's Lee Dilworth. I work for the Storage and Availability Business Unit at VMware. This is my 9th year at VMware, so I've been around a little while in VMware terms, almost as long as ESX, give or take 8 months. Quick show of hands, how many people is this their first VMUG or UKIP? My God, almost all of you. Good. So, good day so far? Yeah, okay. I mean, just to reiterate what my colleague Joe said this morning, you know, we get asked to do these sessions, so these are not designed to be kind of sales pitches. The VMUG committee asked me to talk about availability because it's one of the things that they know me for. I do a lot of the storage stuff as well. So you're always glad to help out the VMUGs. They're great events, and long may they continue. We're going to look at some of the solutions in the portfolio that we have to give you an idea of what tools are there in the kit bag to protect your workloads and your apps, and try and give you some insights into some of the recently announced features in some of the latest versions. I'll try and put my own spin on it as well, give you an idea of where some of these solutions are going. The guys at the back, if you can't see the slides, you know who you are because there's two of you sat right there. Feel free to move forward and join the rest of us at any point if your eyes are a little bit old, because you know some of the graphics might be a little bit small on that screen. So I've got a quick disclaimer slide. If I turn my little clicker on, there we go. That covers me in case I talk about things that we don't deliver, which is always a risk in terms of product delivery. You know, so some of the things I'll try and caveat with years. Although technically, the Americans don't like us doing that now. We're not allowed to talk about which quarter, it has to be the year. That's as close as we're allowed to guess. So some of the things I'll talk about might be things that are shipping in 2015 or 2016, or even other things that we're working on further out. So how many people, quick show of hands, are using what you would class as a VMware data protection product or solution today? How many people have the backup product installed, VDP? Anybody? Okay, a couple. Anybody using vSphere Replication? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. Site Recovery Manager. Okay. How many people are looking for some ideas into what they can do in terms of protecting workloads? Hopefully, most of you. Excellent. Okay. So the good thing is that, or certainly for us in the world of producing protection solutions, that bad things happen. Even recently as last week, I had a customer that actually had to have a full DR test. Well, not actually a test, an actual DR event occurred. They lost their entire site. Thankfully, not physically, as per my kind of Transformers picture there. But it was a logical outage. The data center went down. So they actually did a real failover to their DR site. So these things happen. If you're in my building, in my lab, these things happen on a weekly basis. Despite what the landlord told me when I said that I didn't need UPS. He said, it's all right, we don't have any brownouts here. What he meant was on a daily basis. We have them on a weekly basis, which is nice. And the storage arrays love that. They love going up and down every weekend, as you can imagine. But, there are always going to be outages of any type. Joe talked about the Platform 3 type applications, the Googles, the Facebooks of this world this morning. And, I guess when we get to that stage of our lives, and maybe many of us, hopefully me included, will be retired by then, when every application out there is written in some kind of distributed way, where the infrastructure truly doesn't matter, then some of the infrastructure-based protection solutions that we're going to look at today will start to be, less demanded, because the application will have resiliency built into it. Where we all live in the real world, because most of us, I'm guessing, don't work for Google or Facebook, we don't have those kind of applications to look after. We have what people are cruelly calling legacy applications. And I was actually at a customer recently who actually have a team now called Legacy IT, which is obviously not the side of the room you want to be working on in that company. So it's like this side is Legacy IT, and they actually had a sign hanging from the roof on wire. And then it was New IT were over here, who looked a lot happier. They all had MacBooks and cinema displays and everything else. Legacy IT were kind of, oh, we're looking after all the array-based stuff, SQL, SharePoints, the Oracles of this world. But I think those applications are going to be around for a very, very long time. I mean, I worked at IBM in the early 90s looking after AIX boxes, and people were telling me then that AIX won't last beyond about 1992 because it'll be replaced by Linux. And guess what? I've still got colleagues that work there that are looking after AIX today. And that's almost 10, 15, 20 years later. So things tend to hang around for quite a long time, and we have to look after them and protect them. So in terms of, what are we doing? What are the big changes that we're seeing in our portfolio? A lot of the changes that, again, Joe talked about this morning, we're seeing a lot of the services that we've used over the years for things like backup, replication, stretch clustering technologies, storage technologies. We're seeing a lot of that software that used to only be available with a physical thing, now becoming available as a virtual thing that you can install on any hardware. And if you look around, even the exhibit hall downstairs, or you look at any of the storage vendors that you might see at VMworld, you'll see a lot of them start to sell these data protection solutions as virtual appliances. Because if they don't, I think a lot of them have seen what's coming, that there's going to be an end to that tunnel. There's going to be a point in time when the customer doesn't necessarily want to buy the physical thing just to get the piece of software. You look at what EMC have just released this week. You can now buy Recover Point for VMs that installs natively into ESX. No Recover Point appliance needed, no box needed, just a piece of software that you run that provides the Recover Point data protection suite without having to buy the physical thing. And the other storage vendors are all doing the same kind of things as well, making those services available to you as a virtual service. And that's what we're starting to see heavily in that kind of virtual data services layer there. And the idea will be that you can start to build a platform where those services are just available on demand at the provisioning time by the person that's requesting it, the application team, the business unit. So as easy it is to ask for storage or a network if you're using things like NSX, or if you're asking for compute capacity, you should also be able to ask for and demand things like, I want certain types of backups, I want certain types of replication or DR protection available, and that service should be applied to my workload as it's being provisioned without you having to go scurrying around for months to try and find the storage team to figure out if we've got replicated devices. It should just be available on demand at provisioning time. And you know what? If I change my mind in a month and I decide I don't want asynchronous replication now, I want synchronous because that was on the little list that I saw in the drop-down, I want to change my mind, I should be able to come back and do that as the application owner, and it should just be retrospectively applied to the workload without me having to power it down, turn it off, move it to another data store, or do any of those things. And that's the kind of platform that we're building now, and those services are starting to be repackaged in a way that that's a reality. So we're starting to see that become, this is not 2020 stuff, this is stuff that we're starting to see available now in 2014. And all of those services will be available through this uniform policy control plane. We're using that today in Virtual SAN. We'll be using it in 2015 with things like virtual volumes, and all of the other VMware products will also be hooking into it. So again, whatever management platform you put on that, whether it's VCAC, whether it's OpenStack framework, whatever it is, your data protection services will just live underneath that and be abstracted away from the application owners. And that's the model that we're moving to. And that's where we're going to take you with our products over the next few years. So, we'll start with, I guess the most simplest thing, which is to actually be able to just back stuff up. How many people, show of hands again, how many people were using vSphere data protection? There was about 5 or 6 of you put your hands up. Is that the standard version or the advanced version? The standard version? Okay, and how's that working? Is it working okay, or? Yeah? And how many people know that they can download that with their vSphere license edition, as long as it's kind of Essentials Plus or higher? How many people know that you're entitled to vSphere? Obviously you two guys do, because you've got it. So VMware have been very bad, and this is one of the things that hopefully you learn by coming to VMUGs, at telling people what they can get as part of their standard vSphere license. So, basically the cutoff point is usually Essentials Plus. If you're on Essentials Plus or higher, then there's a whole raft of appliances that you can download to complement your vSphere stack. But everybody looks at them and just ignores them, because they see them on the download page and thinks, that scurrilous sales guy will want money if I download that, so I'm not going to touch that with a barge pole. I'll just download ESX and install it on my server, and off I go. But actually, if you download vSphere Data Protection, or if you download vSphere Replication, or you download the basic version of VCOps, all those things are included with the basic licensing packages. So those first two things there give you the ability to A, back stuff up, and B, replicate it somewhere. So I can stand in front of you and say, technically speaking, you've got no excuses for not having your data protected. And if you tell me that you haven't got stuff to do it, we've given you the tools to do it. We've done a crap job of telling you you've got the tools to do it, and that's poor marketing on our part. And I think some of that is a desire for some parts of VMware to not be too shouty about this is. The Americans don't like saying stuff is free or included. They like to call things bundles, or they just put it on the website and hope people figure it out. And everybody loves looking at license matrices to figure out what they're entitled to, because that's how we like to spend all of our time. But it's only the inquisitive people that suddenly go, oh, hey, I can download this thing, and I can give it an IP address, and I can go next finish, and wow, in my right-click context menu now, I can do replication. And it seems to be working, and I haven't had to give that sales guy any extra money. So all of those tools are there, and we'll talk about some of them today. Yes, you can embellish them, and you can add some management and orchestration products onto them and make them sing and dance a little bit, but the basics are there. So vSphere data protection used to be called data recovery. Data recovery had a checkered beginning. It was an okay backup appliance. It was just to get to the point where it was getting better, and then we replaced it with data protection. And data protection, to give you some confidence in using it, is essentially got EMC's Avamar engine inside it. That's not the way the marketing team like to talk about it. That's the way I talk about it, because it's the truth about how it's built. We essentially take the Avamar engine from EMC, and we file their name off the engine block, and we put a VMware sticker on it that says data protection, and they detune it a bit, because that's part of how it works in real world. But they're not going to give us it with all the bells and whistles. They're going to take some optional extras off the list. We're not going to get the air suspension and the panoramic sunroof. We're going to get basic componentry to allow a backup product to work. So if you download that from our website, you will have a fully integrated backup appliance that will work with vSphere. It's not going to be used to back up physical stuff, so that stops a lot of people using it from the outset. You go into some customers, and as Joe talked about this morning, we still have this very siloed structure in terms of people and process. You've got the storage guy, you've got the backup guy, you've got the network guy, and the backup team will not look at any backup solution in the company that doesn't span every platform they use, which means you're then narrowing your choices down in some cases, because you've got to go to the big backup vendors who have those products, and you're buying TSM, or you're buying one of the other, the backup products that are out there that will work on physical kit, Solaris, and work on mainframe as well. But if you're not in that ballpark, and you just have a mostly VMware environment to look after, then data protection will just integrate with vSphere and allow you to back up your workloads. Easy to deploy. Everyone can deploy an appliance. As long as you can give something an IP address and click next finish, it's pretty much as simple as that to deploy an appliance for VDP. There is, as always, an advanced version, and guess what? Who thinks the advanced version is free? That's the right answer. If I had prizes to give out, you'd all get one. Of course, the advanced version is not free. We are VMware.com, and sadly, we do have to charge for some things. So you might be sitting there thinking, why would I want to buy the advanced version? So very quickly, I'll walk you through what the advanced version does. Essentially, it gives you more scale and more features in a nutshell. But again, some marketing slides behind me, so they're going to say a lot more things. It does give you a lot of flexibility about replication that you'll see in a second. It does come with a bunch of agents that you can install. I mean, VDP out the box is agentless when it's doing it backups. But there are some things that you might be backing up that you might want an agent for, because you might want to do different kinds of backup and resource, such as things like SQL Server or Exchange, where you just want to be able to back up and restore certain databases or mailboxes. So you do want agents for those things. And they come in the advanced version of the product. So the advanced version also includes the ability to do other things, like deploy now in 5.8, you can deploy proxy appliances that give the option. The proxies have an interesting feature in that they allow you to back up things like the Linux LVM or ext4 file systems as well, which the standard appliance doesn't. So you can deploy the proxies to do that. The proxies also allow you to do scale out. So you can now do scale out for the number of concurrent backups that you can support. So by default, VDP will do 8 concurrent backups. If you start to deploy additional proxies, you can obviously scale that out. So you can get up to 24 concurrent backups running at any one time. You can have up to 20 of those things deployed. Now, the reality is there's a big difference. I think I've included a slide on this between what the headline figures say we can back up and what you'll actually do in the real world. And that all comes down to churn rate of data, retention, things that you might have to hit in terms of policy. So, yeah, maximums and minimums guide are good for quizzes at VMUGs. In the real world, they sometimes don't count for too much because the maximum and minimums aren't always achievable. So we'll have a little look at that. So I said replication is possible. So you can do replication with VDP as well. So starting at the top, so if you have VDP or VDP Advanced, both of them can replicate their backup silos to something like EMC Avamar. Both of them can do that. So you don't need the paid version to do that. Both of them can do it. The advanced version can also integrate with things like data domain. So if you're an EMC, anybody an EMC data domain user or have data domain anywhere? A couple of people. So if you use things like DD Boost on the clients, you can inject that as well, and you can back that up to data domain. Or you can even replicate between two VDP appliances that are sitting at two different sites. So for the ultra paranoid, you want a backup of your backups because you don't want everything in a single site. You can actually replicate the backups to a second site, and the second site can replicate its backups to you as well. You can probably also guess, some of you may have seen some Twitter stuff or blog stuff saying that we're going to launch, we've obviously got, we'll talk about it later today, vCloud Air Disaster Recovery. Not surprisingly, where there's vCloud Air Disaster Recovery, there's going to be vCloud Air Backup as well. And you're going to be able to back up into a vCloud Air slicer capacity. Now, you can imagine how we're going to do that by looking at this picture. So we're obviously going to have some integration with you stand up a VDP appliance inside your vSphere environment, and it will be able to simply point at your slice of capacity inside vCloud Air, because vCloud Air will be able to essentially have like an Avamar grid type infrastructure behind it, which we can do multi-tenant backup into. And that service should be up and running in the next couple of months. So if you actually want to just back up straight into the cloud, then you'll be able to do that. This is a bit of an eye chart, but you're going to get these slides for reference. Essentially, you can see the differences between the two products. So obviously, the things that we added in 5.8 are around support for different MS Exchange and SQL and SharePoint agents, and also the ability to have the proxy backups in there. And you'll get that for reference. I'm not going to spend any time really looking at it, but it gives you an idea of the different features that each appliance has. And also look at the limits here. So we'll come to more detail on this in a second. So per appliance, standard appliance can deploy backup 50 VMs. The advanced version 200. In terms of capacity that you attach to the back of them, where you're going to back into, 2 terabytes dedupe for standard, 8 terabytes for the advanced version, and up to 20 each of these. Now, if you do the maths there, that kind of implies that we can do about 8,000 virtual machines, I think, if my maths is working right. But what can you actually do in the real world? So 400 VMs per appliance, 20 appliances, 8,000 VMs. I'm not going to stand here and lie to you and say that you're going to be able to do that for real. Because in the real world, you're going to have retention policies on the backups. You're going to have different size virtual machines. There's going to be, obviously, resource contention on the boxes and the consumption from when the backups are running. So what are people actually seeing in the real world that's a nice, manageable level? And actually, people get bored of managing more than about 4 or 5 appliances is the blunt answer. Once you get to about 5 appliances in most environments, people are like, right, that's enough for me. I don't need to deploy the other 15. I'm backing up as many VMs as I need to. Because remember, think of where we've pictured this, or pitched this in the market. We're not picturing this at customers that have got 100,000 VMs. Probably most of you in this room don't have more than 2,000, 3,000 VMs. Anybody got more than 1,000 VMs? How many have you got? HSBC, you've probably got a lot, which is good to hear because I bank with you guys as well, so yeah. So please make sure you're backing all your stuff up, because that's where all my current accounting is done. But very large environments, are maybe going to look at this and say, maybe that isn't for us because it doesn't have the necessary scale that we want. So the reality is, with the 4 or 5 appliances, normal churn rate of most Windows Server workloads, you're probably looking at across 4 or 5 appliances, about 800 VM management is what you're going to get, and be at nice, acceptable levels. Yeah, if you want to scale out the other 15 appliances, you're going to go a little bit higher than that. But most people, we don't see people deploying 20 appliances typically in production. One question I get all the time is, can we use it to now back up? Anybody kicking the tires or got vSAN in production? Anybody looking at virtual SAN or been to any of the sessions today? So obviously virtual SAN is gaining a lot of interest. It's only been out for 6 months, so it's still very new. But already we're getting these questions. Can I back up virtual machines that are on virtual SAN with VDP? Yes, you can. One interesting thing to think about, which Duncan put a link out this week, people have been doing tests on virtual SAN. A lot of the virtual SAN tests are done with one virtual machine, which whether you're testing backup or you're testing performance of virtual SAN is often a mistake, because if you only have one of something, it's generally not really exercising the cluster properly. So if you have one virtual machine and you're testing the backup speed of virtual SAN, the default policy for protecting disks on virtual SAN is to have one additional copy of the data. So if you've got a little test VM that's, say, 100 gig in size, you've now got 2 100 gig VMDKs, each sitting on 2 different spindles. So guess how many spindles you're going to read from when you're doing backup? 2. Now, if you're comparing that to a VMAX that has got 2,000 spindles in it and you're doing a backup there, guess which one's going to be quicker? Of course, the external storage is going to look a lot quicker because you're reading from more disks when you're actually doing the backup. Now, on vSAN, the ideal way to test the backups is to obviously test lots of backups in parallel to get an idea of how it's going to work. If you just test one in isolation, it's going to really skew the figures. But it can and does work absolutely fine. One thing to note if you do use vSAN is, we do back up the storage policy. So remember what I said about, moving to a world where data protection services are applied as policies now, not things that you have to configure. That policy is contained within the Virtual Center Inventory database, and it's contained within vSAN itself. We also back up the policy that the virtual machine uses as well. So if you restore it into a vSAN cluster, the policy will get restored with it. If you restore it as a net new virtual machine and give it a different name, the policy obviously won't be restored with it. It will then default to the standard storage policy that vSAN uses out of the box. Okay, so that was a quick look at what you can do for backup. So hopefully what you learned from that is, one, you've got an appliance you can all go and play with if you've got a vSphere Essentials Plus license. And two, there's an advanced version of it that has some nice bells and whistles if you want to use those. So what about vSphere Replication? And there were some people using that, so I remember the hands went up. So we introduced this in version 5.0, and much to the disappointment of a lot of people, you had to buy SRM to use it. And as in any beta, one thing that our customers tend to do is they go looking at the advanced settings in the menus to try and figure out what features are coming. Not quite to the degree that Apple consumers do, where they go looking at firmware names and things to try and figure out what iPad version is going to come out in 2050. But they go looking around and say, oh, there's some replication settings in here that seem to suggest that we're getting a replication engine in 5.0. And they were right. What they didn't see is that we, probably wrongly, with hindsight, we only made it available if you used the Site Recovery Manager with it. So that was a little bit of a disappointment. We rectified that in version 5.1. So 5.1, we changed vSphere Replication so that it can now be used on its own standalone. So you can go to the website, if you've got Essentials Plus or higher, you can download the appliance, and you can get vSphere Replication up and running. It will work with SRM, it will work without SRM, and it will work, if SRM is installed, it'll allow you to replicate the things that SRM is protecting and protect other stuff as well that SRM isn't protecting. It will allow you to work in environments where you only have one virtual center, which is something SRM cannot do. SRM will only work between two sites with two virtual centers. So vSphere Replication on its own is actually heavily used in remote office sites where there's only one VC and potentially two sites with a couple of hosts in each, and the VC is managing both. Or it's used in remote sites as essentially almost an on-site backup. So they've got the backup software running, but they also want to have a replica copy of the VM sitting close by it, because sometimes that's a quicker way of getting the service back than to restore from backup. So they'll just replicate to another data store. You can actually replicate to a folder in the same data store as the source VM. I'm not suggesting that's a good protection strategy, but those of you that like to play with stuff at home can tinker around with that. It now gives you a nice, easy way to essentially, if you're doing a home lab, you can have replication in your home lab really simply now. And it's obviously asynchronous, so it's no good for you if your RPO value is less than 15 minutes. We can only be as aggressive as 15 minutes asynchronous with vSphere Replication. So if the application owner comes to you and says, we want synchronous protection or 5-minute protection, you can't use vSphere Replication for that. So, how does it work? Again, it's all built into the client. So you download the appliance, give it an IP address, it registers itself with Virtual Center as an extension. You right-click in the web client, and you'll see underneath where it says All VC Actions, there'll be another right context menu that says vSphere Application Actions. You step through the wizard, you configure the RPO, you decide whether you want to invoke VSS or not, you select a target data store at the other site, off you go, you're done. And it's completely storage agnostic, so you can go from anything to anything. It doesn't matter whether the source ESX host is using only local disk, or vSAN, or NFS, or iSCSI, or fiber, and the target is using a complete opposite set of technologies. As long as ESX can see it, and it's popping up inside the UI for ESX to actually use as a data store, vSphere Replication can take the data out of one environment and replicate it to their environment. So it's completely heterogeneous from a storage point of view. Hence why we use it as the backplane for vCloud Air Dr, because it doesn't require us to have the same storage you have, because obviously that would be very inflexible. So it just allows us to actually have a very simple way to go from anything to anything. It's, like I say, asynchronous, 15 minutes to 24-hour RPO. There's a website just about to go up live, which I'll tweet out on the UK VMUG handle after the event, where we've got some sizing tools up there now as well. So you can actually do sizing in your environment. You can punch in some figures, because that's the one thing that everybody asks me is, how do I figure out what my churn rate is across the WAN? How do I do that? There's also a tool that you can download from our, everybody use the lab site, labs.vmware.com? Anybody know that that site existed? Probably not. There's a few people nodding. If you go on there, there's called a capacity, the Flings, yeah, the Flings site, which is not what you think when you search in Google. So if you just search for Flings, you might get a lot of different results hits. If you search for VMware Flings, you'll get the right URL at the top. There's a capacity planning tool on there for vSphere Replication that allows you to essentially what it does is it mimics an appliance, and it will just run in the background and essentially watch the I/O churn rate of your virtual machine. So vSphere Replication is very interested in the unique rights that your virtual machines are issuing. If you want to use that tool to do some sizing, because you want to have some kind of an idea, like over a month, how much data uniquely changes on each of my workloads, and I'm just going to cherry pick a random sample, that tool will tell you all of that. It dumps it all into a set of flat text files that are then exposes through a nice set of HTML graphs, so you can see all of that information, gives you an idea of how you're going to size your pipe between the two sites. Use that tool before you install vSphere Replication for real. You know, the tool is given away on, as I said, the Fling Labs website as is, so it's not a product that you can ring and get support on. It won't break your environment, he says. I've never seen it break anybody's environment, but you can't install it if you've already installed the actual appliance, because it'll overwrite it in Virtual Center, and bad things will happen. So use it before that you're going to deploy vSphere, then run it for a month, or however long you think is necessary. When you've gathered enough data that you're happy that you can do some sizing with your service provider or your MPLS provider or circuit provider, whoever it is, you just delete it. You don't have to do any uninstall, just delete it. And then you can download the actual appliance and install it. But you can't use the two side by side because they'll conflict with each other. Essentially what the sizing tool is doing is almost just doing loopback. It's tracking the changes that the virtual machine is writing, putting them into a log file, but it's not actually sending them anywhere. It's like just dev null, basically. So this is very flexible in terms of what you can do with it. As I said earlier, it's virtual machine centric, storage independent. So this isn't like LUN replication where everything in the LUN replicates. Each individual virtual machine can be replicating at different rates. And this is starting to give you an idea about how things will look and feel a little bit when we have virtual volumes in 2015, where you'll be able to do the same kinds of things for external arrays. One of the big complaints I get in my day job is customers say, why is it that we still have to replicate our storage array using the volume or the LUN? Why hasn't that changed in the last X number of years, 15, 20 years? Why do I still have to create a 2 terabyte LUN, and if I decide I want replication, everything in the LUN has to replicate? Why can't I just cherry pick individual workloads? That's what you're going to be able to do with virtual volumes when virtual volumes comes online in 2015. And for those of you that want to have a look at that, go on the hands-on lab, hol.vmware.com, and there's a virtual volumes hands-on lab that shows you how to do virtual machine setup with virtual volumes. One shout out there is that when you do that lab, it does confusingly look like we've been lying to you, because a lot of the terms that we use in virtual volume setup look like LUNs and data stores, and you're thinking, you'll get halfway through it and think, this is just exactly the same as the stuff I've been doing for 5 years. VMware have been talking out of there. It's not until you get to the end of the lab and you start actually consuming and using virtual volumes that you suddenly see it's a different storage operational model. That's when you start to see that you can apply different policies to every individual virtual machine. And if you want to be really granular, there will be a point in time in the next 12 months when, if you wanted to, you could apply a different replication policy to individual disks of an individual virtual machine. I'm not suggesting that's a sustainable model, but you could do it if you wanted to. The other thing we can do with vSphere applications, we can keep lots of points in time, up to 24. So, if you've ever used Apple Time Machine and you get that magical flipping of the screen and you can circle back through your calendar and you can say, I actually want to restore to this point in time, not the latest copy of the data. You can do a similar thing here. We keep copies of the virtual machine using snapshots of the recovery site, and we allow you to select the one. We don't have the magical spinning screen thing. That would be nice. It's a little bit more rudimentary in our web client. It's kind of like, here's a list of points in time, pick the one you want, and you go to that one. So we're not quite as animated as Apple are with their technology, but it's the same kind of thing. You can actually let the application owner say, I don't want to fail over to the last copy of the data, I want to go back to yesterday at 2 o'clock. And you get as near as you can in that list of point in time, say, okay, I can fail you back to 1350, and the virtual machine will be recovered to that point in time. I thought you had a question there, just scratching your head. That's fine. Scratching heads is allowed. Reporting has also been included now in 5.8, so we've got lots of reporting. People want to know, how much am I transferring, when am I transferring it, what is the transfer rates that I'm achieving, am I violating the RPOs? If you violate RPOs when you're doing transfers, it's not the end of the world. What do I mean by violate the RPO? Well, if you take a simple example, let's say you set your recovery point objective to be 20 minutes for that VM, and let's say your average delta size that we have to push across the WAN is 100 meg. To hit that RPO, you've got to be able to push that 100 meg in 20 minutes divided by 2, which is 10 minutes. And if you don't, if you do it in 10 minutes and 30 seconds, guess what? 10 minutes and 30 seconds times by 2 is 21 minutes. So you violated the RPO. We'll still push the data, but we'll just flag it and say, that one didn't go fast enough. It took 10 minutes and 30 seconds. So you can have a look at that and say, well, there was something weird going on the production site then, so that's maybe expected. If it continues to climb, or it stays in that state, i.e. it's constantly missing its RPO, that could be an indication of something else going on. There's been a sudden increase in the workload on the virtual machine. Application owner neglected to tell you, surprise, surprise, that 10,000 more users have just come online. Hey, guess what? That might be changing the write rate of the virtual machine. You can then start to correlate that on the same page with, actually the average delta size has suddenly jumped. For the last 3 months it's been doing 500 meg, 500 meg. Now it's doing 800 meg. Why is it doing that? Why has it suddenly changed dramatically overnight? Again, communication inside some customers, application owners don't always tell the infrastructure team, you know what, there's a lot more users on yesterday, we just didn't think you needed to know that. And now all my virtual machines are violating their RPOs. So there's not too many ways you can fix that problem. You've either got to increase the bandwidth, or you've got to reset their expectations on what can be achieved for their particular application. Not everybody's got the flexibility to just make the pipe bigger. Because at the end of the day, you have to be able to push the data at a certain rate, and you have to be able to write it at a certain rate. And if you're at the maximum of what those two things can do, you've got to make one of them bigger. You're either going to be able to write faster, or you've got to push faster, or both. Or you go back to Mr. Application Owner and say, do you really need to be at a 15-minute RPO? Can I possibly set you to 30 minutes or 20? And the reality is that in many cases, the application owners will usually say, oh, actually, yes. As one famous customer of mine had an Oracle rack system in for years, which they spent a hell of a lot of money on. And it was only when the CIO instigated an audit of everything that they spent for every vendor, VMware included, and went to the DBA team and said, right, we're paying, it was something in the order of 1.5 million a year on Oracle licensing, and one of those things was rack. And he said to the DBAs, what do we really need for our databases? And the DBA came back and said, actually, we could suffer 12 hours worth of data loss and still be fine. So you can imagine how long that rack system survived in terms of the next year's budget. That was straight out the window, and that was back to normal array replication and an RPO of 4 hours, because the DBAs had never really sat and thought about what they could afford to lose in that particular business. Different for everybody, so RPO requirements are always critical to figure out what's the right solution. You can replicate from virtual SAN. Virtual SAN doesn't have its own data services built into it today. It's still only 6 months into the market. It doesn't have native replication inside it. So if you want to replicate something that's in virtual SAN, you use vSphere replication to do that, and then you can replicate it to another virtual SAN cluster, or fiber channel device, or NFS data store, whatever it is. You must choose storage policy as well at the other site, and you also must remember that when we replicate, in terms of vSphere replication, it's not necessarily going to validate that storage policy can be applied at the target site. So you need to be aware of that, because essentially you could set up a bunch of replications in virtual SAN, replicate it to another site, and the other site can't meet them because it doesn't have enough storage, it doesn't have enough capacity. Obviously those checks and balances are going to come in potentially the next version of virtual SAN and vSphere application, but right now, 6 months in, those checks aren't there. So you could potentially create a virtual machine and replicate it that actually won't power on at the other side. So although yes, we say you can do this, you've got to do it with a little bit of caution and thought. So if you're replicating, that's what I'm saying on this slide. You're going to get these for reference. I won't go through all of these. So remember, policies are enforced when you provision to virtual SAN. We don't check the policies that have been applied. So if you're replicating today in the 1.0 version of this, remember that you should be fairly lenient with the storage policies that you're using. If you've bumped up the failure to tolerate value, or you've increased the number of stripes of your data a lot, and the target cluster doesn't have enough capacity or is already quite heavily utilized, you may not be able to power those workloads on. So you need to test that. So SRM 5.8, how many people, anybody SRM customers in here? Yeah, oh, quite a few. So SRM is currently shipping 5.8 as of a few months ago. SRM is essentially, I was talking to somebody earlier about this, might be in the room, so apologies if you are and I can't see you. SRM doesn't replicate any data at all. SRM is not a replication tool. So SRM is a management and orchestration tool for recovery. Its job is to ensure that a bunch of things in Virtual Center A arrive successfully at Virtual Center B and have everything they need to power on and start up in the order that you want them to. What is moving the data around is either your storage array underneath or vSphere replication. Those are the only two tools that you can use to move the data from A to B. So storage array replication, including tools like Recover Point and those kind of things, or vSphere replication. SRM then just sits on top of that to provide the orchestration layer and the UI to drive it. So in any SRM deployment, as you hopefully know, you have to have two virtual center servers that have to be at the same version. So if you're using 5.1 on one site, you have to have 5.1 on the other. If you've got 5.5, you have to have 5.5. You also have to have an SRM server at each site as well. SRM server is still a Windows-based install. The 5.8 version does at least now ship with its own database built in, which makes deployment a little bit simpler. As and when the product managers get a little bit more, shall we say, I won't use the crude term, but let's say when they become a little bit stronger in certain meetings, and we tell the storage vendors to rewrite the adapters, because SRM essentially has integration to external storage arrays through an API. Those adapters are all written for Windows-based installs. What would be nice is if we could package SRM in a Linux appliance and just give it to you like that and say, there you go, embedded database, all the adapters are in there, easy deployment model, Mr. Customer, have that. But that requires all of the storage vendors to rewrite all of their adapters, which is not a massive task, to be honest, in my mind. But that's because I'm from the Northeast, and I would just tell them, here's the late date in the diary. If you don't change by this date, you're off the program, and you only support the old version, and you have to tell your customer why. That's the easy way to do it, not the American way to do it. They like to have lots of meetings, conference calls forever, never get anything done. So we get a bit frustrated in Europe because we want it done yesterday. So as and when we can push that through, we can get SRM server on Linux. It's just a small change. Right now, it's a Windows-based install, one at each site, replication underneath. Replication can go in both directions. We just don't draw it in the PowerPoint because it makes the PowerPoint look messy. But obviously, each site could be running production workloads, replicating to the other site in the event of failure. Question? Does it work with a web client is the question. And the final answer to that question, thankfully, is yes. In 5.8, the web client for SRM is there. And it's been the monkey on my back for about the last 2 years because customers are saying, when are you going to have a web client for SRM? Where the hell is it? The reality is it's been sitting on a shelf in engineering for about that period of time, just waiting for us to manage to get some time in the QA guys' window to say, can you test this thing? Because it's ready to go and customers are waiting for it. So finally, in 5.8, we have the web client. You have to use SRM Server 5.8 to use it, but it does give you the full web client access to Site Recovery Manager. Can we replicate to more than one site? So today, the answer is no, we can't. So there is a model of SRM called Shared Site Recovery that service provides. It's designed primarily for the service provider use case. There's nothing to stop you using it, and it's essentially a many-to-one model, and it is supported. It's a slightly more complex install, but it can work. The simpler version would be for you as a customer to say, here's site A, and I want to be able to replicate to to B and C, and potentially D, and then be able to move between any of them. That's where we're working towards with the next generation solution. And the reason SRM is not very adept at doing that today out of the box is because it's been built at the infrastructure layer upwards, and it's tied very much into the storage layer and the replication layer. When you see SRM 6 in 2015 and the subsequent versions, those products are rewritten from the top down to use that policy framework so that then everything is, from a software point of view, and less concerned about the hardware. And that's essentially the big problem that we have today is because we've built this API to say, the storage will tell me about the LUNs, the storage will tell me about the replication. If you come along and say, we've now got a third site, the product can't really look after that third site very easily. There are solutions that are supported. So there are solutions if you have vendors that have stretch cluster solutions, like NetApp with their Metro cluster, or EMC with Vplex. They do offer supported solutions that allow you to introduce the tertiary site. So the way that normally works is that the A and the B site are a Metro, So say that would be like vplex metro. And then from B to C would be SRM with a standard replication tool like recover point. So the customer would primarily, hopefully, stay only between A and B, and their highly available data layer would provide federated HA recovery across pretty much every eventuality. But if you ever need to go to C, you can do that with SRM and the other replication engine. So there are 3 site solutions out there. Once we get to version 6 and beyond, and we've rewritten the product from the top down, then to adopt star strategies and different kinds of cascade and concurrent strategies will become a lot simpler for us. Yes. Yes. So today with 5.8, the vSphere replication, that appliance could be managing SRM replications, and for different sets of VMs, it could be also doing replication to vCloud Air. And the key phrase there is for different sets of VMs. It is technically possible in the UI to replicate a virtual machine with array replication and vSphere replication at the same time. Don't ever do that, because trust me, there are lots of things you could do where strange things would happen in terms of, you could suddenly fail over a VM with vSphere replication that was sitting on an array replicated LUN, and then the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. So it's not a supported topology to actually have a virtual machine that replicates using 2 different types of replication to 2 different endpoints. You could, in a roundabout sort of way, shoot yourself in the foot and end up overwriting your own data. So the UI will let you do that, though, if you know the right way to do it through UI. I'm not going to tell you how to do that, because you'll all probably go in, I'll just try that in production. And then, oh dear, my data's gone. But it is technically possible. But that is a use case that we are looking to support properly with safety net around it. So typical use cases, obviously SRM is used for DR, disaster avoidance through the planned migration workflows, and obviously testing as well. So it obviously allows you to leverage things like copy on write snapshots and storage arrays to do non-disruptive testing. The same techniques can be used with vSphere application as well. So we have all those tools in there, and that's been around since 2008 when version 1 came out. So it's a pretty tried and tested solution, and it works really well. The one thing that I would say is that it is slightly different to stretch clusters, which we'll talk about later. Stretch clusters typically have mainly the center use case as their primary kind of selling point. We can do disaster avoidance with SRM, but SRM, always remember, is cold mobility. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we turn it off and we turn it on again. So like the IT crowd, have you powered it off and on again? Yes, that's what you're doing with SRM. If you have the luxury of both sites being up at the time you're doing the recovery, then obviously SRM will do a full orchestrated plan migration. It will cleanly shut everything down over in the A site, detach all the devices from the ESX host so that there's no ESX host panicking when devices suddenly disappear, and it will bring everything up in an orchestrated way at the DR site, including any customization that you want doing at that point. Like, I want VM1 to come on before VMware 10, and then I want a script to run at this point, and I want this IP address to be changed. All of that stuff can be built into the recovery plans of Site Recovery Manager. That's what it's there for. That's why I call it an orchestration and recovery tool. So what's new? What did we add in? So one of the big things is we put, and we've seen a second, was integration into the automation and provisioning workflows. So we'll talk about the VAC plugin, VCO workflow plugin, and how you make that work. I'll do that in a second. I can't go into a lot of detail on that. I mean, trust me, I did a 1-hour session just on that at VMworld, which was recorded, and there's a demo available if you want to see that. Scale. So we increased the scale a lot. We'll talk about that in a second. The scale is always important, especially to our big customers. That was one of the quiz questions last night. Who was at the V quiz last night? So who remembers what the protected limit is of SRM 5.8? It was the question that they scurrilously said was put in there for me, but I didn't know it was coming in the question. 5,000, yeah, correct. It's on there as well, yeah. And also some simplified management in terms of things like subnet mapping. We'll take a look at those. So the first one is essentially policy-based DR protection, which is a fancy way of saying we can now integrate all of SRM's capabilities into things like, I will keep saying in these slides, vCloud Automation Center. I know that's the wrong name. I know it's called vRAR or something now, or vRealize Automation. I can't really remember. I don't work in that part of VMware, so I'm just calling it VCAC for the sake of simplicity. So essentially using the plugin for VCO, you can now expose all of SRM's capabilities into your workflow blueprints. And as I was telling you earlier, that means that basically in the portal that the application owner sees, they can now select DR capabilities when they're selecting their workloads. So whether they're provisioning Linux desktops or Windows desktops or workloads or server workloads, you can now expose through drop-down lists things that relate to DR policies that you want to expose and capabilities. So now they can choose those at provisioning time. They might have a little cost associated with each one that they have to decide, do I want replication or not? If I do, I take a box. They don't know what happens to the VM beyond that. They don't care. You know, people don't care. You know, if you deploy something to Vcloud Air or Amazon or Google, you don't ring them up and say, what kind of SSDs have I got or what kind of spinning disks, because they're not going to tell you. They just put the phone down. Same thing in these provisioning portals. If you put capabilities in there for DR, people aren't going to ask you how it's done. They're just going to assume it is done because you've exposed it. So the benefits for you is that now we can reduce the operational side of SRM. No longer do you have to keep going back to the SRM UI to add the capability to every VM. You know, if you're protecting 5,000 VMs and someone comes to you and says, do you know what? It might be quite nice if we have this script run when our DR recoveries run. Now let me tell you, if you do that in SRM 5.5, that'll be a real pain in the arse to do that, because you'll have to go into the UI and individually click on 5,000 virtual machines and cut and paste the line to invoke that script into every single one. That's not going to be that interesting a day at work by a long stroke. With 5.8, using the workflows, you could actually build that capability into the workflow. So you could say, when someone selects DR protection, this script is attached to every recovery plan, and it'll be attached to every workload. And you just do that once, and then anybody that selects that, that'll be applied to every single VM that ends up in that particular place. So you've now gone from having to do something 5,000 times to just doing it once. Now, if you watch the video back from VMworld when I showed this, trust me, it's only showing you one thing that you can do. If you actually go and take a look at the VCO plugin, you'll see that there's a heck of a lot of stuff you can do, as with any API. So we've basically exposed the entire SRM API in that plugin. Scale's gone up, so you can go up to 5,000 protected VMs now, or 2,000 concurrent. So if you do the maths, that basically means if you had 5,000 VMs all sitting in one place to protect them, you would need 3 recovery plans. The first two would have 2,000 in each, and the last one would have 1,000. Why is there a difference between these two? Because at any one time, Virtual Center won't be that happy if you throw more than 2,000 tasks at it that are doing recovery, because each task is then doing lots of subtasks. So SRM has a very intelligent throttling mechanism built into it that ensures it doesn't flood Virtual Center to the point when tasks start queuing and timing out. And the sweet spot for that is around 2,000 concurrent recoveries. So it won't throw any more than 2,000 at Virtual Center at one time, but it can protect up to 5,000. There are also some performance and scale enhancements that we've put in there, which are fairly significant. Now, this is a worst-case scenario design. A lot of people are shocked by these failover times. A lot of people don't even think about this. I think a lot of customers assume that SRM can fail over an entire data center in minutes, and the reality is it can't. Historically, the older versions of SRM had a big weakness in that some of the storage preparation phase took a ridiculous amount of time because of the way, not because of the way SRM was built, but because of the way some of our ESX APIs were built. There was nothing technically wrong with the way they were made. They just weren't made to be run thousands of times a minute, because the guy that wrote them never assumed that in 5 or 6 years' time, someone else in VMware would use them in a DR tool. So the guy that wrote the code for rescan, or the guy that wrote the code for unmounting data stores, thought, well, how many times is a customer going to rescan HBAs in a production data center? Once a day, once a week, maybe. Not 100 times in a minute, or across 100 hosts 100 times a minute. He didn't think that way. That's not how he built that piece of code. So you do that with SRM on an environment where you've got, say, 255 individually replicating devices, not in device groups. That's a lot of rescans to do on a lot of hosts all at the same time. If anybody has an environment that big and they want to have some fun, go and do it. Go and do a full cluster-wide rescan of your fabric on all devices, and you'll probably see it takes a little while for it all to come back, especially when you start doing that per device, per host. So what we did in SRM 5.8 is we introduced a set of batch APIs to allow us to group all of those commands together and just issue them once per host and once per device. So this is the worst-case scenario configuration that we could come up with. 250 individual LUNs, no device groups. Most customers tend to put things in device groups because they have a bit of common sense, so they group LUNs together that make up the same application. But this is, like, say, worst case. And then we said, and we want to change the IP addresses on every VM, which means reboot them twice. So that's essentially doubling the time it should take. So you can see in this worst case scenario test on SRM 5.5, to do that, just at the storage step, would take 17 hours. I'm not going to tell you which array we were using because that'd be really unfair. There were arrays that went faster than this, but I can't say the array that went this slow. But there are some arrays that go slower than others. So you can see, just at the storage phase alone, it's gone from 17 hours to 4 hours. And remember, this is worst case scenario, 2,000 VMs, 250 individual ones, and customizing them as well for the IP stack, which is the second reboot. Total time down from 29 hours to 13 hours to do that environment. And with a bit of intelligence and a slightly more logical storage layout and some different storage arrays, you can go a lot lower than that as well. And those performance gains are just achieved by simply getting to ESX55 update 2, or update 1 actually has them in, and then just putting SRM 5.8 on and the update 1 for Virtual Center. You don't have to change anything else. It'll just go faster because the APIs are there. So if you want one reason alone to move to SRM 5.8 and you are approaching anything like these numbers, that's a reason to do it. So we've got the UI. We've got some simplified address management. We'll take a look at that in a second. And we now have our own embedded database. I always get questions from DBAs. Anybody in here a DBA? Did you put your hand up? Good. So DBAs always want to know, despite the fact that we document, this is how you set up the database, this is the privileged permissions, so you give them all that stuff, and you always get an email, thank you for that. How much stuff can I take away? Because now I think just to justify their existence sometimes, I now want to put individual row-level permissions on every line of your database. You can't just say, I'll just have the DB owner account will do, or whatever. They want to take it to the most granular level of detail as possible. And of course, we don't have that information immediately available for every database version. Our developers just say, well, just this kind of account level and privilege will work. Because the SRM database is important. It's got the config in it. But it's not that important because it's not that big that we ever do that level of granularity of testing. So, what a lot of customers said to us is, can't you just embed a database so I don't have to put the stuff in Oracle or DB2 or wherever else? It doesn't seem to use much space anyway. So in SRM 5.8, we've done that. There's now an embedded vPostgres database that you can use. So no longer will you have to answer those constant questions of the DBA about what does the permission on table X, Y, and Z need to be? Because you won't find that in our documentation because there's hundreds of damn tables. And nobody's got that much time to go and figure out what every individual permission can be on every individual table. We just say database owner account, DBA account, whatever it is, off you go and use that. If the DBA wants to spend time dialing it back and back and back and back to see where it breaks, they can do that. But most customers now will just go with the embedded database, I think. IP subnet mapping in 5.8 is a nice feature. When you do IP customization, you got two options before 5.8. You could either use the batch file, which is good for doing lots of updates, lots of VMs at the same time. Looks clunky because it's command line driven, spits out a CSV file, you update it, suck it back in again, it applies the changes to the VMs. Or you do it per VM in the UI. Looks pretty, gets boring when you're doing it for hundreds of virtual machines and you just want to change the the subnet range from A to Z or whatever it is. So to make that a little bit nicer, we thought, well, why not put a subnet feature in that just says subnet A to subnet B and let SRM figure out what the changes need to be. So that's essentially what subnet mapping is. So you can now basically say, I want this particular subnet here to map to that subnet over there. Any virtual machines that are in that subnet will change to this subnet when they go to the other side, and the subnet mapping will figure out what the customization needs to be. You no longer will have to go through and do the spreadsheet yourself to do that. So if you want to go from 192.168.1 to 192.168.2 at the DR site, you just map that network to that network in terms of subnets, and then SRM will find all the VMs in each of those two subnets and say, right, anybody over here 192.168.1 is in .2 over there. And it's as simple as that. Next year, there's obviously integration coming with NSX customers because NSX opens up a whole new arena of things that we can do. NSX gives us a whole new set of possibilities about sucking network configurations out of one site and applying them at the other site. So NSX is going to change that game as well for NSX customers. vSAN with SRM, I won't spend too long on this. This is again for your notes. We talked about some of this earlier. But obviously it will work if you're using vSphere Replication. So in the interest of time, we'll move on. vCloud Air Dr, like I said, first thing you need a vCloud Air Dr account, which gives you a slice of capacity in the vCloud Air network to put stuff in, and a username and password to get at it. Simple as that. You need the vSphere Replication 5.8 appliance, just the same one that you've already going to go back and download today after this session, because now you know you can. And what you'll notice when you go into there is that in the part of the setup, there's an option that says, where do you want to replicate to? And usually what you see there is a little icon that represents a virtual center address or another site. And you replicate to that. And what you'll notice is that where you add the virtual center address of the other site, there's another little plus button next to it now that has a little cloudy symbol on. And if you click on that, it says Add Cloud Provider, which is obviously vCloud Air. And guess what? It asks for a username and password. So you type in the username and password that you just had in your email from the vCloud Air team. It'll go and validate that and authenticate. And then if that's an active account, bing, you'll get a little icon that says, right, now here's a little cloud symbol you can replicate to. So now for some virtual machines, when you want to replicate them, you can not choose a destination virtual center or folder. You can choose the little cloudy symbol, and it'll now start to replicate that virtual machine up into your vCloud Air account. There's different ways you can either just do that, so you can replicate it all across the WAN, or you can do what's called offline data transfer. So if you've got a lot of VMs to push up, and you don't want to replicate them all across the WAN, because guess what, they're quite big, you can do this very sophisticated thing, which is called essentially cut and paste, where you basically stick all the VMDKs onto a disk, and you raise the ticket with a support desk in vCloud Air, and you say, I'm sending you a drive, and I'm sending it securely somehow. You know, I'm not sending it with some kid on a bike. It's going in a secure package, and when it arrives, they'll get it, and they'll take it into the data center, and they'll extract all the VMDKs off there, and they'll put them in folders nice and neatly for you inside your vCloud Air capacity. And when they're done, they'll say, we finished. So then you can come back into your vSphere client, and you can say, right, replicate now. And now the replication engine on your site will say, I can see stuff over there that looks like this stuff. Shall I use that as the starting point? And you say, yes. And then some checksums will be invoked on the source and target to figure out what the changes were from the time the guy in the bike or van left your site and the guy at the other end put it inside the data center. Once the checksum process is finished, we now know what the difference is between the source and target, and we can just start replicating that up to vCloud Air. So it's not as big a task to replicate that, hundreds of gigs or terabytes worth of data up there. The big caveat with this at the moment, very nice service, very robust, a little bit simplistic in terms of failover. Yes, you can do offline testing. Yes, you can do DR recovery. Yes, you can do stretch networking into it, and you can connect it to other vCloud Air capacity that you already have. Doesn't have all the sophistication of orchestration that SRM has. That's coming in Q1. So we're adding some workflow functionality in Q1. And to get the stuff back out of there, if you do want to bring it back on site and you want to replicate it back to you, you have to use vCloud Connector currently, which is not a big deal to install, but it's not what you might be used to if you're used to using vSphere replication. So vSphere replication reversal will come again in Q1 2015. So then you'll be able to replicate it back using vSphere replication as well. So you won't have to copy the whole lot back out. So that's the only slight little negative, but overall, it's obviously one of the most popular vCloud Air services, because for a lot of customers they don't have a second site. So to replicate to somebody else's site is very attractive. It's cost effective, and it's very simple because you just download the appliance, username and password, off you go, you're done. So the last one to cover is something called Metro Cluster, or vSphere, or vSphere Metro Storage Cluster. So these are basically hardware solutions that the storage vendors provide. Can be done in software now as well. Remember what I said at the start? A lot of these products are starting to be sold as virtual appliances. So when you've got a stretch cluster, the basic underpinning is essentially a stretch storage layer. You typically have to be within obviously a synchronous distance, and the usual round trip time across the fabric is 5 milliseconds round trip. We do support up to 10 milliseconds on some solutions today. So synchronous distance that hits those requirements. There's obviously a lot of emphasis on the network here, because you have to be able to stretch the network for the virtual machine traffic, because these solutions fit into the hot VM mobility category, which means if both sites are up and running and you want to move a workload from A to B, you can do that without any downtime, basically a vMotion across the sites. This is the solution that all of your bosses and CIOs think you have in your data center, because it's the one that they talked about on a golf course somewhere or over a glass of wine with somebody else, and they give you 50 quid to go and do this, and then they're really shocked when you say you haven't implemented this in the design, and then you show them what these solutions cost, and they go, oh, right, so you can't get that for 50 quid. No, you can't. But if you have the funds to do this, it's getting cheaper, especially now it's available in software as the underpinning, and you can hit the latency requirements, and you've got the networking in place that allows you to do it. These give you very effective federated HA solutions, essentially. It's like a single virtual center environment that is just stretched across two sites. So it's essentially vSphere HA across two sites. They're very, very good at aggressive recovery times, because there's almost zero storage processing for us to do when one site fails. Because think about it's a stretched storage layer. So if one side goes bang, there's some stuff over the other side already. The only stuff we have to bring online is the stuff that went bang. So that's just a HA restart because the storage is already there. The way that the storage subsystems cut over depends on the vendor, but that's pretty quick. You're talking seconds normally, or even instantly for some storage solutions to do that. So in terms of maximum speed, these are the solutions that people will go for over a short distance, because it's essentially just like a HA design. Where do they miss out a little bit? They do miss out because obviously there's no orchestration there. HA does expose some priority things in the UI. It says like high, normal, and low. They don't really do anything. I don't mean that in a bad way, but when you're talking about HA restart priorities, what you're talking about is how long it takes HA to instantiate a power on task on one of our CPUs. Now, or not one of our CPUs, one of Intel or AMD CPUs. Now, as you can imagine, on most modern CPUs, that doesn't take very long in human terms. You're talking, probably nanoseconds and microseconds. So how many HA power-ons can a host do in a minute? Hundreds, probably thousands on some of the current CPUs. So if you have some things flagged as high, normal, and low, that's going to be like, if EasyJet boarding before they did per book, and everyone's just going to charge for the door. And I'm going to, hi guy, where are you at the back of the bus? I'm there first. It's just going to be a free-for-all. So if you have a big demand for prioritization of startup, and not as big a demand for maximum speed of recovery, like you don't want sub 1 minute or minutes, then you may be more suited to the SRM type solution. If you do need speed and potentially simplicity, because it's just a stretched storage layer, then maybe the vSphere stretched cluster solution is for you. The one thing to say about these solutions is you must test them thoroughly end-to-end before you deploy them in production, because this will change next year, but up to now, it's not that easy to test them post-deployment, because you don't have the ability to leverage on many of them copy and write snapshots. So if you want to do some DR testing, it's kind of a real test. So test it whilst you're putting it in. All of the vendors that are on this program all have KB articles on our webpage that either the information is in the article or it links to a document that shows you how to do the failure impact testing for that solution. So the one thing you must do is work through the steps, pull the cables out at the appropriate points, and figure out, is your system doing what the table says it should be doing? If it says no impact and your VMs go off, something's gone wrong. If it says the VM should go off and restart and it doesn't do that, something's gone wrong. So that's when you stop and you take a step back. Have we missed a setting somewhere out in HA and DRS? Have we misconfigured the fabric? Have we done the zoning incorrectly? Why isn't our system behaving the way it does? Don't trust your partners. If you're employing a partner to do this, to put all of the settings in correctly, I don't mean that in a bad way if there's any partners in the room, but validate what they've done if you've paid them to do it. We had a customer that had a stretch cluster put in by one of our partners. I'm not going to name names for obvious reasons. And they had a site outage. Nothing failed over from the other site that went down. Of course, they rang us because it was our fault, apparently. We looked at the system, we looked at it, and we said, well, you've got essentially on this particular system, there was a setting that said, what do we do in the event of a partition? Who wins, left side or right side? Now, the default is always one of the sides. One of the non-default options, which somebody has to pick, is nobody wins. And that was the setting for every single data store. And that's not the default. So somebody had deliberately set every data store no winner. So as you can imagine, what happened in a partition on the network is that the storage went, okay, nobody wins, pulled the data store from both halves. So that wasn't really the experience the customer was hoping for from this very expensive stretch solution. Not only did they lose the site, they also lost the other site too at the same time. Brilliant. That was like vSphere version 3 when we introduced HA, and we never really fully explained the importance of the network heartbeats. And everybody used to have the default HA setting that just powered everything off as soon as the network even burped slightly, and then you would all ring in and say, thanks VMware, that was good. That looked great in front of my boss when all 400 VMs just powered off with HA. What an excellent HA solution. So if you're putting in a stretched cluster, understand it, validate the work if somebody else has done it for you. Don't just trust that they've followed the guidelines correctly. What we're going to do next year with Site Recovery Manager is finally figure out a way to flog you Site Recovery Manager even if you've got a stretched cluster, whether you like it or not, which is the completely wrong way to position that solution. But the serious side of it is many stretched cluster customers say, I would like some of the operational elements of SRM with my stretched cluster. I like the fact that with SRM, if we screw up one of the VMs, it tells us. If we attach disks to a VM that are not replicating, it tells us. It allows us to do test failovers. It allows us to sequence the startups when it's a whole data center failure. Why can't I do that with my stretched cluster? The bottom line is because you can't vMotion from one virtual center to another, so we can't support those solutions with SRM. In 2015, with vSphere 6, that changes. We introduce vMotion support across sites. So now we can expose an API to those solutions that want it and say, look, if you want to plug into SRM, SRM will now monitor that storage layer in the same way that it monitors vSphere replication and it monitors array replication. And in some customer environments, they're using all three. They're using stretch clustering for the most critical stuff. They're using asynchronous or synchronous replication for the less critical stuff with SRM. And they might be using vSphere replication as well. So SRM version 6 will be able to plug into all of those layers and manage them all through the same UI. So what that will mean is, if you have an active-active stretch storage design with SRM, and you have, say, a local host failure in one site, HA just deals with that. Don't need to get involved. The stretch cluster doesn't get involved. SRM doesn't get involved. HA will sort that out. If we have a disaster avoidance scenario, i.e., you've got chance to move before the disaster strikes, but the disaster could be self-inflicted. You could be thinking, I'm coming in this weekend to do some work in the data center. I think I'll just move everything out. Because last time we did that, it was a complete farce, and the non-disruptive switch upgrades didn't go as well as we thought, and we took the entire data center down and pretended it wasn't our fault. So let's just mitigate that, and we'll move stuff. So obviously for the SRM layer, for the non-stretched workloads, we'll power them off, nice and clean, do a storage update, push them across, power them on. But SRM will now see that some of the workloads are actually sitting on a hot layer. So it will be able to tell the difference between a cold layer of storage and a hot layer of storage. And it'll say, right, okay, these ones have to be off and on. These ones are sitting on, say, a vPlex. I know I can just move them and just do them in the sequence that you want them doing, but I'll just move them using vMotion. And I'll just adhere to that in the recovery plan. And then in the unplanned failure, again, think about how this works in a stretch cluster a day. Site goes down, bang, half your vPlex or Metro cluster is gone, HA just restarts. And remember what I said about how HA will handle restarts. It'll just do them as quick as it possibly can. What you might want to do is have a way to step in and say, look, if we lose a site, and remember with a stretch cluster, you could go up to 10,000 VMs on the stretch cluster layer. You can actually tell SRM to basically disable HA for those protected workloads and say, look, don't do the normal thing, which is just power everything on. Follow the workflow now, because we lost a full site, and actually follow the process that we've told you to. So do this group of VMs first, then this one, then this one, then this one, then this one. When you've finished, turn HA back on for those workloads. So have more structure and sequence to a full site recovery with a stretch cluster. So that's what we're doing for SRM 2015, and there's a bunch of vendors signed up to that. So, hopefully what you've kind of got from that session today is you've got an idea of what each of the solutions does. So you've got VDP in there, you've got vSphere replication, which you can all use out the box. Don't need to buy anything to do that. You've had a quick look at SRM 5.8, see what's used in that. Big thing in there, storage improvements. And then you can now see what's coming in 2015 and beyond. And then obviously in that same time frame, we're going to start to see and hear a lot more about vVols and vVol replication when that comes at the end of 2015 as well. So I'm not sure where we are for time. When was the session supposed to finish? I probably should have looked at that before we start. Well, that's not bad for me. 8 minutes over. I tendency to have a go over. But thank you for your patience. If there's any questions, please feel free to come to the front. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the event. So thanks very much.